The bullet entered 2 inches below his left collarbone. Captain James "Jimmy" Brennan felt the impact before he heard the shot, a sledgehammer blow that drove the breath from his lungs and sent a spray of blood across the inside of his canopy. For a moment, everything went white. The sky, the instrument panel, the German fighter that was still on his tail, all of it vanished into a haze of pain and shock. Then the world came rushing back, and Jimmy Brennan understood that he was dying. It was March 2nd, 1945. Somewhere over western Germany, at 22,000 feet, a P-51D Mustang was falling out of formation with a wounded pilot at the controls. The 357th Fighter Group was escorting B-17s to a target near Leipzig, and Captain Brennan had just taken a 20mm cannon round through the side of his cockpit. The mission had started like any other. Briefing at 0500, takeoff at 0630, rendezvous with the bomber stream over the North Sea. The 357 was one of the most decorated fighter groups in the 8th Air Force, and Brennan was one of its most experienced pilots. 18 confirmed kills, 2 distinguished flying crosses, and a reputation for cool-headedness that had earned him the call sign Iceman. But even the best pilots could be caught by surprise. The German fighters had come out of the sun, diving through the bomber formation with cannon blazing. Brennan had seen them coming, had banked into a turn to engage, had lined up a shot on a Focke-Wulf 190 when the Messerschmitt appeared on his tail. He never saw the 109 until it was too late. The German pilot was good, very good, and he had used the chaos of the dogfight to slip in behind Brennan without being spotted. The first burst missed, the second didn't. The round itself had fragmented on impact, sending shrapnel through his chest, his left arm, and the instrument panel in front of him. His airspeed indicator was gone, just a shattered dial with a bent needle. His altimeter was cracked but still functioning, the numbers barely visible through the spiderweb of broken glass. His artificial horizon was spinning uselessly, the gyro destroyed by the same burst that had nearly destroyed him. And there was blood, so much blood. Brennan looked down at his chest and saw the hole in his flight suit, saw the dark stains spreading across the leather, saw the bubbles forming at the edge of the wound with every breath. Sucking chest wound. He knew what that meant. He had seen men die from wounds like this, seen them drown in their own blood, gasping for air that couldn't reach their lungs, their eyes wide with the terror of suffocation. He had maybe 20 minutes, maybe less. The Messerschmitt that had shot him was still out there. He could see it in his peripheral vision, circling for another pass. The German pilot had scored a hit, and now he was coming back to finish the job. Brennan's left arm wasn't working properly. The shrapnel had torn through the muscles, and the arm hung uselessly at his side, blood dripping from his fingertips onto the floor of the cockpit. But his right arm still worked, and his right hand was still on the stick. He pulled the Mustang into a tight turn, gritting his teeth against the G-forces that sent fresh waves of agony through his chest. The horizon spun crazily. He was flying by feel now, by instinct, by the 1,000 hours he had spent in cockpits since he was 16 years old. The Messerschmitt overshot. The German pilot had expected his target to fly straight and level, to do the sensible thing and try to nurse his wounded bird home. He hadn't expected the American to turn and fight. Brennan got a glimpse of the German's tail as the fighter flashed past, a Bf-109G, late model, with yellow nose markings that identified it as belonging to one of the Luftwaffe's veteran units. A good pilot in a good plane, but Brennan was better. Even with a hole in his chest, even with one arm useless, even with blood filling his lungs, he was better. He rolled the Mustang onto the German's tail and pressed the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns roared, sending a stream of tracers across the sky. The German tried to brake, tried to dive away, but Brennan followed him down, his vision narrowing to a tunnel, his world shrinking to the gun sight and the target and the desperate need to kill before he died. The rounds found their mark. The Messerschmitt's engine exploded in a ball of orange flame, and the German fighter began its final plunge toward the earth below. Brennan didn't watch it fall. He didn't have time. He was already dying, and he had a long way to go. He turned the Mustang west, toward home, toward the airfield in England that was 150 miles away. 150 miles, at cruising speed, maybe 45 minutes of flight time, at his current condition, an eternity. But James Brennan had no intention of dying over Germany. He had made a promise to a girl named Catherine, back in a small town in Ohio, and he intended to keep it. The promise had been simple. On the night before he shipped out, standing on her parents' porch with the fireflies blinking in the darkness, he had taken her hands and looked into her eyes. "I'll come home," he had said. "I promise." "Don't make promises you can't keep, Jimmy." "I don't." She had kissed him then, and he had carried that kiss with him through training, through deployment, through 18 combat missions over Germany. Every time he climbed into the cockpit, every time he felt the Mustang lift off the runway, he thought about that promise. He was not going to break it now. He was going home. The first 10 minutes were the worst. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain was rising to take its place. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass, the shattered edges of his ribs scraping against his lung with every expansion of his chest. The blood was pooling in his left lung now. He could feel it, a wet heaviness that grew worse with every passing minute. He tried to assess the damage. The wound in his chest was bad, very bad, but the bullet had missed his heart by inches. If it had hit his heart, he would already be dead. The left lung was probably collapsed, filling with blood, but the right lung was still working. As long as he could breathe, he could fly. His left arm was useless. The shrapnel had severed something important, tendons, maybe, or nerves, and the limb hung dead at his side. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore, couldn't move them, couldn't do anything but watch the blood drip from them onto the cockpit floor. The blood on the floor was a problem. It was making the rudder pedals slick, making it harder to control the aircraft. He tried to wipe it away with his boot, but more kept coming, a steady stream that wouldn't stop. But he could still fly. The Mustang's controls were designed for single-handed operation in an emergency, and his right hand was steady on the stick. As long as he stayed conscious, as long as he kept breathing, he could keep the aircraft in the air. The problem was staying conscious. The blood loss was catching up with him. His vision was beginning to blur at the edges, and there was a strange ringing in his ears that hadn't been there before. He was cold, so cold, despite the heated cockpit and the leather flight suit. He was going into shock. He knew the signs, had seen them in wounded men before. The pale skin, the rapid pulse, the confusion that crept in at the edges of thought. He didn't have 20 minutes. He had maybe 15. Brennan did the only thing he could do. He climbed. The Mustang rose through 25,000 feet, then 30,000. At this altitude, the cold would help slow his bleeding, would buy him precious minutes. The thin air would make it harder to breathe, but he didn't have much breathing capacity left anyway. And at this altitude, he could glide. If the engine failed, if he lost consciousness, the Mustang could cover miles and miles in a long, slow descent toward England. Every foot of altitude was insurance against the death that was creeping up on him. He leveled off at 32,000 feet and set a course for home. The English Channel appeared on the horizon 23 minutes later. Brennan had lost track of time somewhere over Belgium. The world had become a blur of pain and cold and the endless drone of the Merlin engine. He was flying on instinct now, his hands making corrections that his conscious mind barely registered. The Merlin, that beautiful, reliable engine that had never failed him in 18 missions. He could hear it now, humming steadily at cruise power, burning fuel and producing the thrust that was carrying him home. He had never loved a sound more than he loved that engine note. He thought about the men who had built that engine, factory workers in England, probably, men and women who had never flown a plane, who would never see combat, but whose work was keeping him alive right now. He wanted to thank them. If he made it home, he would write a letter to the Rolls-Royce factory and thank every single one of them. If he made it home. But he saw the channel, the silver-gray ribbon of water that separated occupied Europe from freedom, the boundary between enemy territory and home. Below him, the landscape of Belgium gave way to the beaches of the coast. He could see the scars of the war even from this altitude, the craters and bunkers and ruined buildings that marked where men had fought and died. D-Day seemed like a lifetime ago, but the evidence was still there, written on the earth. He was going to make it. He was actually going to make it. The thought brought a strange clarity. The fog in his mind lifted slightly, and he became aware of things he had stopped noticing. The blood that had soaked through his flight suit and was now pooling on the seat beneath him, the way his heart was racing to compensate for the fluid loss, the growing darkness at the edges of his vision. His vision. That was getting worse. The edges of his sight were going gray, narrowing to a tunnel that focused only on the instruments in front of him. Peripheral vision was the first to go when blood pressure dropped. He remembered that from the survival training that seemed so long ago now. He checked his instruments. Airspeed was holding at 280 miles per hour. He had pushed the throttle forward without realizing it, trading fuel for time. Altitude was 31,500 feet, slowly dropping as the engine labored in the thin air. Heading was 270 degrees due west, straight toward the airfield at Leiston. Leiston, that was home. That was where Catherine's letters waited in his footlocker, where his bunkmates would be wondering why he hadn't come back with the rest of the formation, where the ground crew would be preparing for the aircraft's return. He wondered if they knew, if anyone had seen him get hit, had seen him fall out of formation. He wondered if they had already written him off as dead, had packed up his belongings, had sent the telegram to Catherine. He tried to key his radio to let them know he was coming, but his voice wouldn't work. His throat was full of blood. He had been coughing it up for the past 10 minutes without really noticing, and all that came out was a wet, gurgling sound. No radio, no contact, just the Mustang in the sky and the distant promise of home. He crossed the channel at 30,000 feet, leaving occupied Europe behind him. The English coast appeared through the haze, the familiar shape of the Suffolk shoreline, the patchwork of fields and villages that he had seen 100 times from the air. 20 miles to Leiston. Maybe 7 minutes of flight time. He could do this. He had to do this. Brennan began his descent. The approach was the hardest part. At altitude, flying was simple. Point the nose in the right direction and let the airplane do the work. The Mustang was a forgiving aircraft at cruise, stable, responsive, designed to be flown by young men with minimal training. A wounded pilot could keep it in the air almost indefinitely, as long as he stayed conscious. But landing required precision, precise airspeed. Too fast and you would overshoot the runway, too slow and you would stall and crash. Precise altitude, come in too high and you couldn't stop in time. Too low and you would hit the trees short of the field. Precise alignment with the runway. Drift too far left or right and you would ground loop, flipping the aircraft end over end. Landing required both hands on the controls, constant adjustments, the full attention of a pilot who wasn't bleeding to death. Brennan had one hand. He had maybe a third of his blood supply left, and his vision was so blurred that he could barely see the runway. The field appeared through the haze, the familiar rectangle of concrete, the hangars and buildings clustered at one end, the control tower with its glass windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Home. He was so close now. He began his descent, dropping through 20,000 feet, then 15,000, then 10,000. The air grew warmer as he dropped, but he didn't feel it. He was past feeling anything except the pain in his chest and the desperate need to keep the airplane flying. But he had something else. He had 10 years of flying, starting when he was 16, and his uncle had let him take the controls of a crop duster over the cornfields of Ohio. He had learned to fly before he learned to drive, had spent his summers buzzing the fields at 50 feet, had developed an instinct for aircraft that couldn't be taught in any classroom. He had 1,000 hours in fighters, from P-40s in training to P-51s over Germany. He had landed in crosswinds and rain and fog. He had brought damaged aircraft home a dozen times, nursing wounded birds back to the runway when others would have bailed out. And he had a promise to keep. He lined up on the runway from 3 miles out, using the compass and his memory of the approach pattern he had flown 100 times before. The Mustang was heavy now, sluggish, the controls responding slowly to his inputs. He was losing hydraulic pressure, another piece of damage he hadn't noticed, and the aircraft was fighting him every step of the way. Gear down. He reached across with his right hand and pulled the lever, praying that the mechanism still worked. 3 green lights appeared on the panel, geared down and locked. One less thing to worry about. Flaps. He pulled the flap lever to half extension, felt the aircraft shudder as the drag increased. The airspeed dropped through 150, then 140, then 130. Approach speed for a Mustang was 110, but he was coming in fast. Too fast, because slowing down required power adjustments that his one functioning hand couldn't manage while also flying the airplane. He would have to fly it onto the runway. No finesse, no smooth touchdown, just point the nose at the concrete and hope the landing gear held. The runway rushed up to meet him. He was too high, too fast, everything wrong. But he had no choice. He couldn't go around. He didn't have the strength, didn't have the blood, didn't have the time. He pulled the throttle to idle and let the Mustang sink. The wheels hit hard. The aircraft bounced, came down again, bounced a second time. Brennan fought the controls, trying to keep the wings level, trying to keep the nose straight, trying to prevent the ground loop that would flip the aircraft and end his journey in a ball of fire. The Mustang stayed straight. The wheels held. The aircraft rolled down the runway, slowing, finally coming to a stop 300 yards from the end. Brennan sat in the cockpit, his hands still on the stick, his chest heaving with breaths that brought fresh agony. He had made it. 150 miles with a bullet in his chest, and he had made it. Then the darkness that had been creeping at the edges of his vision finally won, and Captain James Brennan slumped forward against his harness. The ground crew found him 30 seconds later. They had seen the Mustang coming in, had seen the erratic approach, the hard landing, the aircraft rolling to a stop far short of the usual parking area. They had known something was wrong before the wheels touched the ground. The tower had been tracking the aircraft since it appeared on the horizon, an unidentified P-51 that wasn't responding to radio calls, flying a straight-line approach that ignored all standard procedures. Sergeant Bill Patterson was the first to reach the cockpit. He was the crew chief for Brennan's regular aircraft, and he had recognized the markings even before the plane touched down. He ran across the tarmac, his heart pounding, praying that the captain was alive. He climbed onto the wing, grabbed the canopy release, pulled back the plexiglass bubble, and stopped dead. There was blood everywhere, on the seat, on the controls, on the inside of the canopy, blood that had sprayed and pooled and dried in the cold air at altitude, then liquefied again as the aircraft descended into the warmth of the English afternoon. The pilot was slumped forward, his flight suit soaked crimson, his face pale as death. For a terrible moment, Patterson thought Brennan was dead. Then he saw the slight rise and fall of the pilot's chest, the shallow breaths that were still coming despite everything. "Jesus Christ," Patterson breathed. "Medic! We need a medic now." Other ground crew were arriving now, drawn by the shouts and the sight of the crashed Mustang. They gathered around the aircraft, staring in disbelief at the damage, at the blood, at the pilot who had somehow flown this broken machine home. They pulled Brennan from the cockpit as gently as they could, unfastening his harness, lifting him out of the blood-soaked seat, laying him on the wing while someone ran for a stretcher. The medics arrived in an ambulance that had been summoned the moment the damaged aircraft appeared on the horizon. The senior medic, a captain named Harrison who had seen more wounds in 3 years than most doctors saw in a lifetime, took one look at the hole in Brennan's chest and shook his head. "He's lost too much blood," he said. "No way he should be alive." "He flew 150 miles like this," Patterson said. "Landed the airplane by himself." Harrison stared at him. "That's impossible." "I watched him do it. We all did." They loaded Brennan into the ambulance and rushed him to the base hospital. The doctors worked on him for 6 hours, closing the wounds, replacing the blood, reinflating the collapsed lung. They transfused 4 pints of blood, then 4 more when his pressure kept dropping. They debrided the shrapnel wounds, removed fragments of metal from his chest and arm, sutured the torn flesh with hundreds of stitches. The surgery was brutal, complicated by the extent of the damage and the amount of blood Brennan had lost. Twice his heart stopped, and twice the doctors brought him back with adrenaline and chest compressions. By the time they were finished, the operating room looked like a slaughterhouse. But he was alive. They told Patterson afterward that Brennan had lost over half his blood volume, that his left lung had been completely filled with fluid, that by every medical standard, he should have been dead somewhere over Belgium. The human body couldn't function with that much blood loss. The brain couldn't maintain consciousness. The heart couldn't pump effectively. But somehow, impossibly, James Brennan had kept flying. "Will he make it?" Patterson asked. The surgeon, a tired-looking colonel who had been operating on wounded pilots for 3 years, rubbed his eyes. "He should be dead 10 times over, but his vitals are stable now. If he survives the night, he'll probably pull through." The colonel shook his head. "I've never seen anything like it. The man flew 150 miles with a wound that should have killed him in minutes. That's not medicine. That's something else." "What?" "Willpower, maybe. Or stubbornness. Or something I don't have a name for." The colonel looked at Patterson. There was something in his flight suit pocket, a photograph of a woman. "Do you know who she is?" "His fiancée, girl from back home, Catherine." When we were working on him before we put him under, he kept saying her name over and over, just Catherine, Catherine, like it was the only word he knew. Patterson nodded. He understood now. He understood what had kept Brennan conscious for 150 miles, what had given him the strength to land the airplane, what had made the impossible possible. A promise. A simple promise to a girl back home. He went back to the flight line and looked at Brennan's Mustang. The ground crew was already inspecting the damage, cataloging the holes, assessing what could be repaired and what would have to be replaced. There were 37 separate holes in the aircraft. The 20mm round that had wounded Brennan had also taken out half of the instrument panel, severed 2 hydraulic lines, and punched a hole in the fuel tank that had been slowly draining avgas the entire flight home. By rights, the airplane should have fallen out of the sky. By rights, the pilot should have bled to death. But James Brennan had made a promise, and he had kept it. Brennan woke up 3 days later. Catherine was there. She had received a telegram from the Army, wounded in action, condition serious, and had taken the first train from Ohio to New York, then the first military transport she could talk her way onto. It hadn't been easy. Military transports weren't supposed to carry civilians, and the officers at the airfield had told her no a dozen times. But Catherine had a stubbornness that matched her fiancé's, and she had refused to leave until someone found her a seat on a cargo plane heading for England. She had arrived at Leiston 12 hours after Brennan landed, and she hadn't left his bedside since. She had held his hand through the surgeries, had prayed through the nights when his fever spiked and his pulse weakened, had refused to eat or sleep until the doctors told her he was going to survive. Now she watched as his eyes fluttered open, as consciousness slowly returned, as he looked around the hospital room with the confusion of a man who didn't know where he was. Then he saw her face, and for a moment he thought he was dreaming. Then the pain hit, the deep, burning ache in his chest, the throbbing in his useless left arm, and he knew this was real. "Hey," he croaked. His voice was barely a whisper, his throat raw from the tubes they had used during the surgery. "Hey yourself." Catherine's voice was thick with tears, but she was smiling, the smile that had kept him alive for 150 miles. "You scared the hell out of me." "Sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just don't ever do it again." He tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough that sent fresh waves of pain through his chest. Catherine gripped his hand, his right hand, the one that still worked, and held on tight. "The doctors say you should be dead," she said. "They say no one could fly 150 miles with wounds like that. I had to come home." "You almost didn't." "But I did." He squeezed her hand weakly. "I promised you I would." Catherine leaned forward and kissed his forehead, her tears falling on his face. "Don't ever make me wait like that again, Jimmy Brennan. I mean it." "I won't." He meant it, but they both knew that wasn't entirely in his control. The war was still on, and wounded or not, he was still a fighter pilot. When he healed, if he healed, they would want him back in a cockpit. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, he was alive, and Catherine was here, and nothing else mattered. He closed his eyes and slept, and for the first time in 3 days, the sleep was peaceful. The Army Air Forces awarded Brennan the Distinguished Flying Cross for his flight home. The citation mentioned extraordinary airmanship under the most adverse conditions, and complete dedication to duty despite wounds that would have incapacitated a lesser pilot. It didn't mention Catherine. It didn't mention the promise he had made in a small town in Ohio, the promise that had kept him conscious for 150 miles, the promise that had given him the strength to land an airplane when he should have been dead. Citations never mentioned things like that. Brennan spent 4 months in hospitals, first in England, then in the States. The wound in his chest healed slowly, leaving a scar that would ache in cold weather for the rest of his life. His left arm regained partial function, enough to hold a cup of coffee or turn a page, but never enough to fly again. The Army offered him a desk job. Training command, they said. He could teach young pilots how to fly, pass on the skills that had kept him alive when he should have died. He turned them down. He had made a promise to Catherine, and he intended to keep it. He had promised to come home, and he had. Now he was going to stay home. They were married in June 1945, 3 weeks after the war in Europe ended. The ceremony was small. just family and a few friends from the squadron who had managed to get leave. Brennan wore his dress uniform with the Distinguished Flying Cross pinned to his chest, and Catherine wore a white dress that her mother had saved from her own wedding. When the minister asked if he would love and cherish her for the rest of his days, Brennan thought about the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang, 22,000 feet over Germany, with a bullet in his chest and 150 miles of sky between him and home. "I will," he said. He meant it more than anyone would ever know. They went home to Ohio. Brennan got a job at a local airfield, teaching crop dusting to young pilots who reminded him of himself at that age. The work was good, simple, honest, nothing like the deadly skies over Germany, and it let him stay connected to the flying that had defined his life. He couldn't fly himself anymore. The damage to his left arm had been permanent. The nerves had been severed, and even the best surgeons in the country couldn't repair them. He could grip a steering wheel or hold a coffee cup, but the fine motor control needed to fly a plane was gone forever. It was hard at first. Flying had been his identity since he was 16 years old. The first time he stood on the tarmac and watched one of his students take off without him, he felt a grief so sharp it took his breath away. But Catherine was there. She held his hand and let him grieve, and when he was ready, she helped him find a new purpose: teaching, passing on what he knew to young men who would carry his skills into the sky. He was good at it. The students loved him, this quiet, scarred veteran who never raised his voice, who explained things patiently, who seemed to understand exactly what they were feeling before they said a word. He taught them to fly the way his uncle had taught him, by feel, by instinct, by the unspoken connection between pilot and aircraft. Catherine worked at the local school, teaching 3rd grade, and in the evenings, they would sit on the porch of the small house they had bought and watch the sun set over the cornfields. Sometimes Brennan would talk about the war, not the killing, not the fear, but the beauty of flight, the camaraderie of the squadron, the sense of purpose that had driven them through the darkest days. Sometimes he talked about the flight home, the blood and the pain and the 150 miles that had seemed impossible. Catherine would listen, holding his hand, understanding better than anyone what that flight had cost him. "Why did you keep going?" she asked once. "When you knew you were dying, why didn't you just bail out?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the sky, turning orange and pink with the setting sun, and thought about the question. "Because I promised you," he said finally. "I promised I would come home, and a promise is a promise." "Even if it kills you?" "Especially then." He smiled, the crooked smile that Catherine had fallen in love with years ago. "Besides, I was too stubborn to die over Germany. I wanted to be buried in Ohio." Catherine laughed, even though there were tears in her eyes. "You're impossible, Jimmy Brennan." "That's what the doctor said, but here I am." "Here you are." They sat in silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. And for James Brennan, who had flown 150 miles with a bullet in his chest, who had landed a dying airplane on a runway he could barely see, who had kept a promise that should have been impossible to keep, for James Brennan, that was enough. He had made it home. That was all that mattered. James Brennan lived until 2003. He died at 81, in the same small town in Ohio where he had been born, surrounded by Catherine and their 4 children and 11 grandchildren. The end came peacefully. He had been sick for several months. His lungs, weakened by the wound 60 years before, had finally begun to fail. He spent his last weeks in the bedroom he shared with Catherine, looking out the window at the fields where he had first learned to fly. On the last morning, he woke early, before dawn. Catherine was asleep beside him, her gray hair spread across the pillow, her face lined by the years, but still beautiful to him. He watched her sleep for a long time, remembering all the moments they had shared, the wedding, the births of their children, the quiet evenings on the porch, the thousands of ordinary days that had made up an extraordinary life. He thought about the flight home, the blood and the pain and the 150 miles that had seemed impossible. He had never forgotten that flight, never stopped marveling at what his body had been capable of when Catherine's face was waiting at the end. "I kept my promise," he whispered. Then he closed his eyes and slept. And this time, he didn't wake up. The Distinguished Flying Cross was buried with him, pinned to his chest one final time. The funeral was small, just family and a few old friends from the flying days, but one of his former students, a man named Jack who had gone on to fly for the airlines, stood up and spoke. "Captain Brennan taught me to fly," Jack said. "But more than that, he taught me what it means to never give up. He flew 150 miles with a bullet in his chest because he made a promise. And he spent the rest of his life teaching young pilots that flying isn't about skill or reflexes or natural talent. It's about heart. It's about refusing to quit, even when quitting seems like the only option." He paused, looking at the flag-draped casket. "I've been flying for 40 years, and every time I touch down on a runway, I think about Captain Brennan. I think about what he did, and I ask myself, do I have that kind of heart? I hope I do. I hope we all do." Catherine followed him 3 years later. She was buried beside him, in the cemetery overlooking the cornfields where he had first learned to fly. Their headstone is simple. Just their names, their dates, and a single line from a letter Brennan had written to Catherine during the war. "I promised I would come home, and I did." Today, if you visit the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, you can find a small exhibit dedicated to the pilots of the 357th Fighter Group. There is no mention of James Brennan by name. His flight was one of hundreds of remarkable feats performed by the pilots of that unit during the war. But there is a photograph of a P-51D Mustang with 37 holes in its fuselage, parked on a runway in England, its pilot being loaded into an ambulance while ground crew stare in disbelief. The placard beneath the photograph explains the damage, the 20mm round, the severed hydraulic lines, the fuel leak that should have brought the aircraft down. It explains that the pilot flew 150 miles with wounds that should have been fatal and landed the aircraft without assistance. Visitors pause at the exhibit sometimes, staring at the photograph, trying to understand what they're seeing. Young people, mostly. Kids who have never known war, who can't imagine what it would be like to fly a damaged aircraft with a bullet in your chest. Some of them read the placard and move on, adding it to the list of facts they've collected during their museum visit. But some of them stand there for a long time, looking at the photograph, thinking about what it must have felt like. The pain, the fear, the 150 miles of sky between you and home, with death creeping closer every second. And then the landing, the impossible, perfect landing that brought a dying man home. The placard doesn't explain how. It doesn't explain why. Some things can't be reduced to placard text and museum displays. Some things can only be understood by a man who made a promise and kept it against all odds. 150 miles. A bullet in his chest, blood filling his lungs. And he flew home anyway, because a promise is a promise. And James Brennan was a man who kept his word. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. These stories of incredible courage and determination deserve to be remembered and shared. Drop a comment below. Could you have kept flying 150 miles with a wound like that, knowing you were dying? Could you have held on? And if you haven't already, check out our previous video on the P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that carried Captain Brennan home against all odds. Until next time.